this meeting. So if you guys don't mind, I'll just hit record so we can keep this for future purposes. I'm just going to make sure that everyone except the panelists are on video. So Lamia, if you can switch off your video so we can make sure that perfect. Cheryl, thank you. Leila, thank you. Roberto, thank you. Very quick introduction. We wanted to make this panel session to really bring about more insights around podcasting in the Middle East, seeing that in this landscape, there's so many changes that have been happening. So with that being said, I just want to introduce Cheryl King, Leila, and Roberto. Please have a minute to just talk a little bit more about your work. What do you do and why this session matters to you? Go for it, Cheryl.
Sorry, yeah, I think my audio just cut, but yeah, all good. So you were just asking for a quick intro. So yeah, no worries. So it's I'm Cheryl. I'm the managing director of Markettiers MENA. We're really excited, and thank you so much, Ali, for setting this up. And yeah, great to kind of be on the panel with Leila and Roberto. So thank you. This is, I think, going to be really interesting and a great topic. We've been in the business of audio broadcasting for the last sort of 15 years at Markettiers. I suppose that the way that we would come at this is from a brand perspective. So we're in the business as podcast strategists, working with brands to help them tell their story through the power of audio. So not sort of in terms of producing necessarily, but also in terms of the strategy behind that, the distribution and the measurement. So I think there's a massive opportunity for podcasts in the region. I think this region is primed for it more than ever. And yeah, really looking forward to the rest of the debate.
Thank you. Leila, feel free to take the floor.
Hello everyone, hi, I'm Leila. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Finyal Media. Finyal Media, for those of you that aren't familiar, is a podcast network. So we produce a ton of different shows. We currently have about 15 within the network, which we distribute across third-party platforms from Apple, Google, Spotify, and Rami, Deezer. Pretty much anywhere you can find podcasts, you'll find our stuff. And our mission is really to tell audio stories that will help young people in the Arab world reconnect with the region and the culture of the region. We also have a talent hub. So I'm coming at this sort of partly from a production perspective, but also from the point of view of growing creative talent in the region. So we have a talent hub called Finyal Studios, where we partner with independent content creators. Someone's child has something to say about that. Where we partner with independent content creators to help them also get their podcasts off the ground. So we're always looking for kind of new talent to come in and promoting the industry in general and helping podcasters in general to become more financially sustainable and grow the industry in general.
Thank you very much, Leila. Thank you about that, and sorry about the child. Roberto, go for it.
No, guys, for one time, it's not my children, so I'm happy. No, look, hello everyone. My name is Roberto. I'm the managing director for Microsoft for Startups. I've been with Google before that for a long time. I joined, as part of a company, DoubleClick, that at the time was revolutionizing a little bit like the media buying and the advertising industry. So I've been into media advertising for a long time, and I'm always passionate about understanding more about audience behavior, consumer behavior, and the different channels through which brands can engage audience in the new modern world. With the programmatic advertising wave, it has been also really cool to see how you can buy now media more programmatically through the different channels. In my role at Microsoft, as I deal with startups, I'm very interested about the podcast in order to have more of the entrepreneurs across the region to share their stories, to share what has been working for them, to share more about when they are into these choices or compromises, the ups and downs, to share more about that. Podcast could be a great channel for entrepreneurs in the region to inspire more the young generation and the next wave of entrepreneurs across the MENA region. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Roberto. So for many people here, podcasting is a very new concept. Many Arabs aren't like Americans who have adopted the behavior of podcasting, who have really integrated podcasting within much more of their lifestyle, if we're talking from a percentage perspective. So my next question here is to Cheryl. I think that so Markettiers have produced I believe, if not the only, I believe the only reports on podcasting in the region, or the latest reports, if I could say, in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and they're constantly updating in terms of not just the behavior of listeners in the MENA region, but they're learning more about advertisers and how we can get the best return on our buck. So I'd like to give this sort of next question to Cheryl. Like, what are we learning about podcasters, listeners' behavior, and how is COVID-19 changing the landscape around podcasting in the MENA region?
Yes, it's a good question. And I think we were excited. We launched the first podcast reports into the landscape in the MENA region, as you said. And the reason we did that is because there wasn't any data that really existed before that. You know, we had kind of general facts and figures. But when we were sort of talking about the concept of pushing podcasts for brands, it wasn't the first question people would ask us was, you know, how many people are listening, you know, what's the stats, what's the data? And there was nothing that really existed in the MENA region up until then. So in June last year, we launched the first report into the podcast landscape of the UAE. So it showed that 16% of the population are regular podcast listeners, which is kind of, it puts us a little bit on the par with markets such as the UK, which is about 18% at the time. So it gave us a good grounding, and it showed very much, I think the main thing that came out was that podcasting is a very highly trusted medium. We repeated the exercise again, actually in April 2020. So slap bang right in the middle of lockdown. And our kind of report into Saudi shows us quite similar figures to the UAE. So similar numbers, about 18% of the population in Saudi listens to podcasts at least once a month. So they're defined as kind of regular podcast listeners. Again, I think the huge thing, what we've learned through the kind of pandemic, is that although I think in-car play has been down. So basically that's how, you know, when you listen to a podcast on your commute to the office, for example, you know, people aren't going into work as much anymore. It's very much a work from home culture. Those numbers are of course falling by the wayside, but it just means people are consuming podcasts in different ways. And what we actually found was that podcasts, I think in the MENA region, is up by about 8%. Which is super interesting, I think, especially because we have quite an oral sort of storytelling culture, you know, stories getting passed down through generations. And to Finyal Media's point, I think that's where they have a real kind of opportunity in the market to kind of exploit the kind of storytelling side of things. But it's been, I think, really fascinating to kind of do that deep dive. And we also found that sort of 1 in 4 women in Saudi are defining themselves as consuming podcasts more regularly. And again, I think it plays into the trust factor of podcasts. You know, it's radio on demand, people buy into the host. And that's, I think, where advertisers have also a huge opportunity to win big, because you buy into that host. So yeah, it was really interesting. And I think definitely the coronavirus has, if there's been kind of any sort of small shoots of greenery, it's done quite well, I think, for the podcast environment, because it provides that platform where you can listen on the go and do other things.
Yeah, oh, that's fascinating. I think that the fact that the Dubai market, or let's just say the MENA region, because we know Saudi as well is so powerful in podcasting, and I think it's safe to say that the reports are now online. So for people who would like to read those reports, they are on Markettiers. How can they get a hold of that? Sure.
Yeah, if they just gone to markettiers.com, you can just download them straight away, and there's kind of all the kind of data and the exec summaries there. But yeah, it's been good to do that exercise, and the idea is that we'll sort of benchmark those reports as we go forward and repeat that exercise. But definitely the climate, I think, in which we did the Saudi report, you know, during the pandemic was quite kind of telling to show how kind of listener figures have shifted, and it really did, I think, canvas the opportunity for podcasts in the region, just in terms of those numbers there.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl, for that. I just want to sort of pivot here and shift my question to Leila now, being sort of very involved in the production side. Why is podcasting gaining that much attention? Where is the need, and what are you working on in terms of like we know Finyal has many shows. Where's the attention going on, and what is the region demanding more of right now?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So it's a big one. Why podcasts are gaining traction in the region, and I think there's a few different ways to tackle it. But from every angle you look, things are moving in a direction that is making the podcasting sector rise at a very rapid pace. So you have the demand for podcasts going up. You have an increase in the supply of podcasts every day in the Arab world. And you also have the infrastructure around it that is changing very rapidly, with the big sort of streaming platforms and big tech players investing a lot of money in building the infrastructure that helps podcasts to do better. So, I mean, on the demand side, what we've seen is that, listeners, as Cheryl's report, put forward, listeners, the number of listeners that we have, particularly here in the GCC countries, is growing very fast. And I think part of the reason for that is because a lot of young people here don't really relate to sort of mainstream media anymore, and they don't see themselves reflected in the sort of traditional TV or radio. They don't see themselves, their friends, their family, their stories being told. And part of what we're trying to do is start telling people's stories sort of through our own lens, through the lens of the kind of young people today. And we try and do it in a very kind of immersive storytelling way that helps people to sort of escape and embrace the medium even more. So on that front, I mean, the types of shows that we've seen doing really, really well in the podcasting space have been the kind of more immersive fictional stories. So for example, our biggest show is actually 1001 Nights, which might be kind of a surprise because people typically think of podcasts and they think of talk shows and interviews and that kind of thing. But actually, 1001 Nights has been a really huge hit in the region. And we've sort of taken the classic tales, but very much adapted them for a modern audience. So re-scripted them, we've added layers of sort of soundscaping and brought in sort of genuine dynamic voice actors to kind of really bring the stories to life. And that's worked really, really well for us. So we're building on that and doing a lot of content in that vein. So we also do the stories of Juha. We're about to release the stories of Sindbad. So there's a lot of stuff along that line that is working quite well for us. And then on the supply side, I think what you've seen is that because podcasting as a medium has relatively low barriers to entry compared to some other forms of media, a lot of people have taken to releasing their own podcasts, which has helped to sort of boost the industry in general. And we saw that during COVID as well. Actually, there was, the supply of podcasts in the region went up quite drastically when people realized, actually, I'm sitting at home, I have a phone, I have some really basic equipment, I can do this, and they have stories to tell and they wanted to share them. So I think that's helped as well.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right with the entrepreneurs, and this is like where I want to go next with. Sometimes I think that especially, for example, in the MENA region, we don't have a conference that allows for the connection of this very niche podcasting sector to get to know each other. Whereas in the States or the US, there's podcast movements, there's Podfest, there's so many places where you find thousands of people getting together and sharing tips and tricks and ideas. So sort of, Roberto, this is a question more to entrepreneurs right now. Where do you see the opportunity now knowing that the medium is pretty intense in storytelling? Do you see an opportunity for entrepreneurs? We know the infamous Gary Vee. We know so many people that like to share nonstop. And so my next question is: do you see entrepreneurs adopting behaviors such as sharing their journey, using podcasting as a way to connect deeper within their own communities in whichever business that they are doing? Do you see that as a or forecast a trend there perhaps, or how do you see podcasting merging within the entrepreneurship scene in the MENA region?
No, look, Ali, great question. So first of all, there is no such event here, so you should come and set it up. It will be pretty cool. Yeah, I believe as long as leadership needs to have a voice. And that applies for people working in corporations, but also entrepreneurs, right? So sharing and giving back to the community is something really, really important. So definitely across this region, as entrepreneurship is rising, as the ecosystem is getting more mature, as there is more openness, especially in the post-pandemic where, you know, the only way economy is going to differentiate from oil into knowledge bases by sharing and by building on top of each other, having this sort of growth mindset, right? So having this new wave of entrepreneurs here that are open to share their experience, you know, it's not a black and white anymore. It's more a gray world where, you know, it's more uncertain. So people sharing the compromises they've been through, sharing the journey they've been through, and building their community on top of that is great. At the same time, the opportunity I see from an entrepreneur perspective is also, you know, how you really engage and connect with your audience or with the community you tap into, right? So if I'm not mistaken, a very high percentage, if I'm not mistaken, 80% of people would listen to an entire podcast episode, which is, it's really impressive, is most of it, right? So what this tell me is that the podcast listeners are really very engaged in the content. So content plays a critical role in being successful in developing engagement with the audience and the real successful podcast. On top of the host, of course, which create this emotional connection with the people hosting it, right? But there is this reference to the podcast as listener experience more than the user experience, right? So how you can hook people, create interesting content, which means editing out a lot of the opening chit chat of topic tangents and pauses, and go straight to the point, be relevant, share learnings, sharing back, maybe have one clear call to action, be concise, etc., etc. So it's a unique opportunity, I would say, for entrepreneur in the region to give back to the community, to share, to engage their audience. I've seen also this trend of creating microcasts, so shorter version, 5-10 minutes. Neil Patel, for example, has been doing that, you know, sharing tips or specific things very shortly, so people would engage probably more as well. So I believe this is a great tool in the hands of entrepreneurs in the region to market more themselves, to give back to the community, and to share more with other entrepreneurs.
Yeah. No, I completely, you know, I see where you're going with this here. And it's also very important to note that the podcast listener, the behavior, according to reports here, most of them are like around 50% of them have a higher education degree. It's different to, that's a very different type of listener than a YouTube sort of a YouTube viewer or an Instagram follower, right? Because now podcasters have to understand that we're being measured by downloads here. We're being measured, like there are metrics that even if anyone understands how to sort of get into podcasting, which can be taught very, 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 very simply, people still do not understand the analytics behind podcasting. What does a download mean? And this is sort of where I want to head towards with my next question to Cheryl or Leila here. As a new company, for example, if we're Coca-Cola, if we're a company that wants to harness this intimate way of connecting with our listeners, a listener that has a higher purchasing power, because this is what reportings are saying, there's a high level of trust in podcasting. How can we as creatives start figuring out best practices to advertise on a podcast? Because that is even a very new concept when we go to ask big companies how or what's working, because that's very new. And I want to really tap into our listeners listening to us right now, wondering, well, what on earth could this new world look like?
Shall I take this thing? Sorry.
Go for it. Yeah, I'll add on to you.
Okay, I'll just start off, I guess. So yeah, I mean, like you said, partnerships with brands are a really important way for podcasts to sort of get off the ground, I think, and help the industry to evolve. So there's a couple of different ways that most podcasters partner with brands. One is, like you said, just by doing the sort of straightforward ad spots and doing pre-rolls and mid-rolls and giving the advertiser an opportunity to position themselves as kind of aligned with that podcast and get their message out there. And that's great for kind of, brand awareness, reach, and, as you said, targeting an incredibly premium segment of the market, because, these people are highly educated, they are higher spenders than average. They're very young, they're very tech savvy, they're mostly on iOS. So it's a really strong demographic for an advertiser. But the other partnership model that a lot of podcast companies work on is doing the more sort of branded content. So what a lot of brands have done internationally, and now increasingly here in the region, we're working with a few, is to create their own shows, which allows them to put out sort of more long form messaging, where they can kind of have a little bit more control over the content, and they can, create content that people want to engage in and want to immerse themselves in, that is not a straightforward, intrusive kind of ad forced down the throats of the listeners. So I think both directions are starting to take off here in the region, and we're seeing a lot of growth on both fronts.
Yeah, and I definitely agree. And just to add some kind of stats around that as well, like in what we've seen as well, again, going back to the trust factor of podcasts, is that from a kind of advertiser's perspective, sometimes we know when you go onto YouTube and you get that sort of 5-second ad first of all, and you're like, okay, that's a bit annoying. You kind of wait until you can skip so you can get onto the content. With podcasts, they are a bit more unobtrusive, and I think we did some research and found that 78% of people kind of approve of ads in podcasts, and actually there's around about 68% of people that made a purchase after listening to an ad in a podcast based on that. So it just shows, again, I think the power that people invest in that host. You think about these popular podcasts where the host is kind of talking about a new brand or a new product, and you immediately, as a listener, because you've already brought into that podcast and that person who's delivering it, you immediately somehow feel it's almost validated. So I think from an advertiser's perspective, that's great, and that's brilliant in terms of kind of swelling that ecosystem and moving the podcast industry towards that kind of billion-dollar industry that we were talking about. But I also think as well, from an entrepreneur's perspective, there's so much you can do with podcasts from a kind of traditional sort of PR perspective too. And we talk a lot about kind of working the asset as hard as possible. So every single podcast episode, there's so many kind of things that you can do with it really to kind of maximize its potential. So whether it's filming the podcast, just like the Joe Rogan ones now on YouTube, that's a very simple way. Even actually, of course, social media, creating your assets, creating your audiograms, putting spend behind the first few episodes at least, just so you're kind of getting that community, because a lot of the time you're starting from ground zero, you're starting from zero. So, but you need to kind of create that engaged content. But I think with podcasts, the reason why I like them from a PR perspective, beyond kind of, writing a press release where maybe sort of 10% people reading it might be relevant, everyone listening to your podcast is there because they want to be there. You're not an accidental listener. You have to kind of seek out that podcast at the point of interest. So that's again why content is so important, because you can get someone there because they might be interested in fitness or psychology or the general subject matter, but you need to get them there. And to Roberto's point, that is why so many people are listening to the end of podcasts. I think they're around about 43 minutes on average in the region. You can say a lot as a brand within that time. So just by making that content really compelling, you want to kind of keep people there as well. So yeah, I think there's so many different ways and different metrics from advertising to PR that you can do as an entrepreneur as well.
Yeah, especially if I may chime in, Ali, I totally agree with both Leila and Cheryl, especially in a world where they're telling us that the span of attention is a few seconds, right? So this data that Cheryl shared is amazing. 43 minutes, the average time where people listen to the end of the podcast is really amazing. And thinking about the audience, so we said the audience here is smarter, maybe is young, affluent, tech savvy. So also the way they search for things online, right? So a podcast, if they are including to voice search, right? So then the percentage increase in all searches being done via voice will just increase. And as podcasts are included in search results, you can now listen to podcasts directly from the result of your search, right? So, or you can save an episode for later. And at the same time, the way you can optimize to help rank your podcast, choosing a keyword for each episode, for example, or creating a specific page for each episode, or maybe a blog attached to it that, drive also the engagement, the traffic to that is really key. On the entrepreneur point, I totally agree. We are working, for example, with a partner, is a PR agency partner that we are, helping some entrepreneurs to go through that, because it's a great PR tool as well, right? So building content to advertise, if you want, with content, what an entrepreneur is doing, what is the value proposition, and also position himself with the right image as well. You can either do the video of the podcast, or you can extract from a podcast, some pills of that message that you want to give. You can either extract shorter part of the audio, or some quotes that you can use again and again, as a follow-up, and engage with your audience with content. That's beautiful. So that's where also we see the opportunity, definitely through podcasts.
Roberto, do you feel that, like, now we've seen the Apple introduce, I believe it was HomePod, the speaker. Do you believe I know this might be out of the scope of this conversation, but there's obviously a fight here to bring, Spotify versus Apple, because Apple came up with the term podcasting, right? There's obviously, and I know this is why Leila said, they're mainly iOS users, and that's a very important, it's a very important thing to have it in your mind, because even when I sort of release an episode on Empathy Always Wins, my own show that I make from this bedroom, I instantly get like over 30, 40 listens a day, and I don't use any I don't post on social media, I don't post anywhere. It just simply, people get it on their phones as a notification because of Apple Podcasts. Now, that's something you have to, turn post on notifications if you were an Instagrammer making a post, making a call to action, and all these things. So my question here is, where do you see the competition in terms of, Microsoft, Apple? Where is the world going in terms of search engine optimization, in terms of what are we competing over? Are we competing over apps? Are we competing over attentions in different websites? Are we competing over what's your take on that?
Yeah, look, well, your last question is a difference. So there are two things in what you're asking. So I guess, so first of all, yes, definitely there is more podcast platform competition, right? And this can only be good, in my perspective. So this is what can push, more development, more features that are added, thinking of the listener experience, as we said before, not just the user experience, but the listener experience, and connect the dots across the journey that the users go through today. So more competition is only healthy. So it's true that on one hand, as you mentioned, I think it's about 0.5% of the 12 to 34 years old, if I'm not mistaken, they listen to Spotify each month. And I think it's about 20%, if a little bit more, on the Apple Music, right? But still there is more competition that came into place. There have been acquisitions as well. So these players are going out, sniffing and sourcing, new ideas, new ventures, new startups that can increase the user experience, and add maybe on the data side, on the analytics side, on the listener experience, or specific features that are more geared towards Generation Z or millennials, and so on and so forth. So to your point, I guess on the competition side, I would say this is healthy. This is going to bring more innovation. It's not just the Spotify and Apple. There are other players that are coming into it. Think about even Facebook, YouTube. They definitely are going to build best-in-class audio-specific products and begin to distribute podcasts probably in mass in going forward. So there will be more attention, more competition, I would say, in this space. Then the second question you raise is actually the more interesting to me, because you're saying what is that they are competing for, and I guess what you are competing for is the time and attention of the users, regardless of the channel, right? So at the end of the day, you are engaging with an audience that you can interact with through different channels, different platforms, but the content and how you talk to them, this is what is relevant, and the experience that they you want them to go through to be consistent and drive towards your call to action, or what you really want them to do as a result of your messaging or of your engagement. So I would say, yeah, the real competition, I would say, is broader than just the pure podcast platform. Is at the end of the day, you are grabbing a part of the time and attention of these people, and it seems like these people, at least the people that are engaged today, are really engaged with the content. So they are really putting attention, and they're really giving their time into the time of the podcast. So you have a unique opportunity. Once you capture the attention of an audience, you have a unique opportunity to engage them and to be relevant. And the branding content strategy Leila was mentioning, I guess it's a beautiful strategy to really increase the engagement with your audience.
Yeah. No, I definitely can. It's a very, very, very wide question for sure. So I'm quite happy you mentioned the listener experience here, because I think many listeners sitting here want to understand, how can I make money with podcasting? I mean, that's the ultimate question, right? We're in the business of podcasting. If Leila, I believe Finyal is really focused on that, and recently you got a very good seed investment as well. What is the can you walk us through a podcasting business model, just one type of business model right off the bat, just for our listeners here to understand how the business of podcasting really works?
Yeah, sure. So most podcasts are funded in a couple of different ways. One of them, as I mentioned earlier, is the kind of advertising / sponsorship model, and that's quite a big part of our business, and it's a big part of it's probably the most dominant revenue stream for podcasts in more mature markets like the US. And that seems to be the most, the sort of revenue stream that is dominating at the moment. Now, to be able to sort of monetize your podcast through advertising and sponsorship doesn't necessarily mean you need to be, one of the leading players in the podcasting space in the region, right? Or anywhere globally. I mean, you don't, as long as you have an audience that is engaged with your content and that represents a specific segment of the market that I think that can be interesting to brands, then there's definitely something to sell there. So, I mean, the way I look at it sometimes is a little bit like the difference between sort of macro influencers and micro influencers. So as a macro influencer or sort of a big scale podcast network, you might have really strong reach of sort of millions of downloads a week. But at the same time, you know, the levels of engagement with the content might not be on the same par as a much smaller, more niche podcast that is very, very specifically focused on, say, I don't know, entrepreneurship or a specific kind of sport. So there is this kind of whole long tail of different genres of content that can be an amazing brand fit if you can find exactly the right brand to partner with. So I definitely think there is a huge market out there, and we see it growing and interest growing from brands all the time to advertise on podcasts in the region. It's just a question of finding the one that most closely can align with your content. And then in terms of, you know, other ways of monetizing, one of the classic things to do is sort of more of a licensing model. So that works slightly better if you're doing more sort of scripted content, because scripted content can be easily, especially if it's sort of evergreen, can be easily licensed in a kind of seasonal block to another platform that might want to air that show at a later date. I even see, you know, podcasts going in the same direction as sort of other forms of media like TV, where big formats have been created in one country and then exported globally to different countries. And we're starting to see that here now, where local companies are taking US podcast formats and adapting them for a local audience and re-scripting them in Arabic and launching them here. And that seems to be working pretty well. But I also think there's no reason why we can't be the exporters here in the Arab world. We have enough creative talent to be creating incredible content that we can then, license out to different markets around the world. So those are the two main revenue streams, I would say. And then there's the branded content and those kind of things. But they're less for individual podcast companies, I think, and more for individual podcasters, and more for people that are in the business of podcast production as a company.
Thank you, Leila. This is, I think, very insightful for us when we come to think of, I believe, how we can make something out of our podcast as well, especially if our podcast is very niche, and we have many people who are highly specialized professionals, such as psychologists, such as fitness trainers, that want to share more than just themselves in the arena, that want to have content that lives forever. And as Cheryl said, works as a great PR strategy. I mean, for me, as a mental health youth leader, that when it's so hard to bring in money because it's such a taboo still, I think it's a great way to connect with some of the world's best leaders, and it's a great PR strategy. So I think for Cheryl, the next question is, my show isn't in Arabic, it's in English, and I'm Middle Eastern. So how are we going to, where is the opportunity for Arabic shows? I think that many people here are from the Arab world. We just got a comment from Oman right now, from Hamad. Where's the opportunity? Are people, I know that, the podcasting report that Saudi, that you produced out of Saudi, showed an interest in Arabic demand. Can we talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. So we saw in the reports, I mean, it's interesting, and I guess to support to Leila's point as well, I think there is, what we saw through our reports is there has kind of been this whole sort of convergence of the landscape here. So not that just obviously Apple, Spotify still reigning big, but there's this kind of, I think, trend for more local content from the region by the region. For the region by the region. So local content creators are definitely winning big, and even in the aggregator platforms that we see, I mean, of course, we've got Spotify and Apple kind of wrangling for the top spots, but we also see like the likes of Angami. We see Deezer launching over here as well. I know Deezer had its first podcast, I think, in Saudi. It's interesting to see, I think, that how this region is really embracing it and putting its own kind of made in the region stamp on it, and that's really exciting to see. So, and for local content, I mean, we see a third of a podcast now are in Arabic as well. So that's just showing how people are really sort of looking towards that kind of local content also. Perspective. I mean, we're working with some big brands on different podcast series, and the notion is having them, it's Arabic first mentality. So having the first episodes in Arabic, and then thinking, okay, do we want to, how's that going to perform? Do we want to pivot towards English? But Arabic is definitely kind of winning big, and it shows because I think, again, it goes back to that sort of storytelling culture. Radio reaches more people here regionally than TV, especially in certain countries as well. So that audio storytelling first dialogue with people is definitely being something that can be built on as well. So yeah, it's been, I think, really quite refreshing to see that how we're embracing podcasting over here and really sort of making it our own. And especially with, there's so much talent in here, as Leila mentioned also. So that there's so many kind of podcasters, even like yourself, Ali, creating your own podcast from your bedroom. People are doing that because, as Leila mentioned, the barrier to entry is very minimal. You don't need all the sort of too much investment like video content. Audio content is a lot more simpler and easier to do. Of course, making a great podcast series needs excellent audio. There's lots more things to think about, but it still has that kind of very open, very accessible way. And I think we're working with one brand on a podcast series at the moment, and the reason they love it so much is because it's mobile first mentality. And you look at this region, you think about how many smartphones do people own in the region as well. You know, smartphone proliferation levels are at an all-time high. You know, internet levels are at an all-time high. You know, podcast works very well to that because it is, you know, radio on demand. You don't need Wi-Fi. You can download the podcast. You can listen to it at your leisure. And again, you know, you're listening to that through the one device that's common to everyone, which is your smartphone. So from a brand perspective specifically, when it comes to Arabic content, I think, yeah, it's definitely winning big. And it's exciting to see the kind of swell of Arabic podcasts too.
Yeah. Wow. I think this brings me to think, you know, and I think Leila did stress this point a little bit. We need Arab talent or Arab creators or creators from the region to make content that can then be internationally exported. I know the Podcast Academy, I was in LA for the podcast movement conference where I believe it wasn't Gimlet, it was Wandery's CEO who sits on the board of the Podcast Academy, which is kind of like the Grammy Awards. He was telling me that the international scene is growing incredibly. So before we just take our Q&As, what's one thing you know, Roberto, Leila, and Cheryl would encourage our listeners here to do in terms of, from a creative standpoint, whether, do you believe that, for example, there is a way to enhance our ability as creators in this new space? Are there, what types of show, like I know many people hear about interview style shows and hear scripted shows. Are there any other types of ways of podcasting that our listeners can even explore as young creatives as well? And if so, what would be one way, or what would be one tip that you would like to sort of leave our listeners today with?
I will give it a crack first. Oh, you want to go first, Cheryl? Go. Go ahead.
No, Roberto, no, after you.
Well, okay, look, first of all, I would say, so the creativity that we have in the region is thinking about the region at large is amazing, right? There are countries that are really producing great creatives, great content, and this is beautiful. So I would definitely encourage, first of all, this diversity of thinking. So we have been talking about localizing, for example, in Arabic, and this is great. So, but to me, it's not just the translation, right? It's not just the language, it's what comes with that, which is the cultural diversity, the nuances across the different things. So that is something that can definitely further develop across the region. I'm working with a startup that is not a podcast, more on video, is kind of a YouTube, but for the Arab world. So Arab mentors or Arab people with great experience that are teaching to other Arab people, not necessarily in this region, but globally. And they have a ton of content. Is amazing. I'm just thinking the same sort of thing on podcast would be really cool, and because there is a lot of that has to do with the nuances and the culture of the region, and that can be transferred to other people, to the new generation, and engage the audiences in a beautiful way. And the other message would be on the quality of the content. We mentioned it probably many times here in the conversation, is content is king. Yeah, and in the span of attention that you have an opportunity to really, give the messages in the right way, get your audience to listening to the great content. One thing I would encourage as well is the authenticity of the podcasts, right? So the ones that at least strike me most or engage me more are where I really connect emotionally with the host, or where at the end of the day, you remember how people make you feel, not what they necessarily tell or what they do or what they tell during the podcast. So is also the authenticity that comes out of the podcast, whether it's a conversation or whether it's more the host engaging and delivering the content, to me is also key.
Thank you, Roberto.
Yeah, I was just gonna, and absolutely, I think with the content for sure, and then also I think for entrepreneurs or anyone looking to make their own podcast, you can have the best content, but it sounds silly, but if you don't tell anyone about it, then it's sort of a little bit that it's value and all the work that gets put into it, it does sort of get lost a bit. So definitely always think about, you know, your distribution strategy, your promotion strategy as well, that there's so much you can do with a podcast, and there's so many different aggregator channels that you can be on. But beyond that as well, you know, of course, through social media, through you know, working that hard, through different ways, through YouTube, through all your different channels, you know, even leveraging the guests that are on the podcast as well and their digital following too. You know, that's another way to look at it. Even through kind of AI software, you can get the transcript of the podcast, and there's brands like McKinsey that do that quite well as well. So you can even kind of read the podcast as well as kind of listening to it. So there's just a lot of things you can really do just to kind of get that message out there. And I think because you know, you are starting from scratch all the time with that audience, you know, you're starting from the zero up, you know, you need to sort of get those listeners on there. You need to drive people to those different platforms. So the more kind of marketing in PR you do around that organically and even paid for, you know, in the early days, that will help you get your kind of audience. And once you've got them, you know, you just need to convert the downloads to the subscribers. Then you've got a very loyal, very engaged audience that's yeah, completely bought into your series.
Thank you, Cheryl.
So my last thought would be, you know, if you are thinking about starting your own podcast and you have an idea that you want to get off the ground, honestly, there's never been a better time to do it. I mean, the platforms that we have available to us as content creators today are so incredible. You know, you can use a platform like Anchor or Audacity, or there's so many more that can really take you right through from A to Z of launching your podcast, you know, fine tuning the editing and distributing, even monetizing to some extent. That I think that it's really, everything is out there to help you kind of make this a success. I'd say the one thing you just have to be absolutely sure about is that you're creating content on a topic that you are really genuinely passionate about. Because this authenticity angle is so critical in the podcasting medium. If you're not passionate, listeners will see through it instantly, and the show is not going to work. So I think you need to have that kind of grit, the passion, the tenacity to kind of make sure you continuously put the content out on a regular basis. You don't give up after, you know, a couple of weeks, or start, you know, making the schedule less continuous as it was before. And to be able to do that, it needs to be something that you really love and that you really want to kind of share with people. So don't do it for the sake of it. Do it about something you're really passionate about.
Thank you, Leila. Yeah, for sure. Listeners can, you feel it right off the bat, and it's just a second away before you put something on that you actually like. So now we're just going to be doing some Q&As for the next 5 to 10 minutes. I believe one of our questions was, so we'll take it from here. So how is the pre-production scene? And this is directed to any of our panelists here. How is the pre-production scene in the Middle East, and especially in the Gulf region? Are there any firms specialized in just pre-production services? We're struggling to find sound engineers. Like, how is the scene looking like? And if someone is now looking to start their own show, if they're not quite familiar on the pre-production, they have a great concept, which I think is a great question. How is the scene right now? Are there key players, or would you, what would anyone do in that situation? Is the quality important, or is it just like, it has to be audible? And of course that refers to the segment you're aiming for, right? If it's narrative or if it's conversational and all these things. But back to our question, how is the pre-production scene in the Gulf region?
So just so I understand the question correctly, pre-production to us is typically the work that's done before you start the recording. So it's sort of any research that needs to go into the show, or the guests that you're going to be interviewing, or any actual script writing. So that kind of process is more of a sort of research-based or creative or writing process. I think maybe the question is more about the sort of the equipment and the sort of sound engineering required on the in the production phase. Is that right?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah. Okay. So so look, if you go to a site called Audacity, it gives you incredible videos, tutorials, that kind of thing on you know, sound engineering, editing, that kind of thing. platforms like Anchor will really take you through from A to Z. I'd also say if you have an amazing idea that you want help with, we do partner with independent content creators ourselves at Finyal Media. So if anyone wants to start their own thing and is looking for a partner in that, then please do reach out. But I think, yeah, either you do it by yourself and you figure out what sort of basic equipment you need, and we're happy to share, details on, what's the basic kind of list of stuff that could get you started. Or you can go to a studio and, rent it out by the hour, and it will often come with a sound engineer. And there's plenty here in Dubai. There are many in Riyadh and Jeddah. So depending on where you're based, it's pretty easy to find a studio where you can get that kind of help.
Yeah. Yeah, and even a small project I ran last month, and I'm running for another week with Roberto, was the art of podcasting. We've created a course that's very simple. I share all the ways of how I do things here. It's a 101 really, and beginner's guide to podcasting for the independent podcasters, not of course for the big players, which if anyone's interested, I'd be happy as well to share. And then there's another question here. How many listeners are there in the UAE, Cheryl? How many listeners are there? How many listeners are there?
Well, I imagine, but like now, I think it would probably have changed a bit, but when we did a podcast report back in June last year, so I guess very different environment back then, but we found, that there was 1.3 million regular podcast listeners. That was defined as people that listen to a podcast at least once a month. So I would imagine that has now grown. I mean, even when we did our podcast report in Saudi, we found that actually was a really interesting market. And we actually first thought about doing the reports at the Middle East Podcast Forum a couple of years ago, and we were talking about the fact that we were just about to launch our UAE report, and everyone was like, why aren't you doing it in Saudi? This is a huge market, that there's so much potential over there. So we felt, we had to kind of compare and contrast those figures. But again, like when we, got that report off the ground, and we did it amongst a sample of 2012 people in Saudi. So it's a good robust sample to go for. I think the environment was really kind of quite telling. So I'm quite interested to do that and repeat the same exercise as a bit of a benchmarking a year on in, and we kind of can see how it's going. But I think, just to put that into context, where the UAE and the region compares to kind of the big mature markets, you've got like the US, you've got South Korea, you've got, a lot of Asian markets are very advanced when it comes to podcasting, but they consume podcasts over there very differently. They're often more of an education tool. And people for example, in China, all podcasts are behind a paywall. And that's kind of just how the model is. Over in here, we have Luminary as a bit of a paid for play podcasting, but we're kind of not quite there yet. But I think here it's just exciting to see the numbers there, and the fact that I think 75% of people when we did our report in the UAE have heard of podcasting. So that's exciting to see the potential and how it's going to develop. So I think from here on in, it's going through a renaissance at the moment. As you said, it's nothing new in a way. It's been around since Steve Jobs coined the term back in 2005, but now it's having its heyday, and it's, I think, a fashion that's here to stay. So it's it'll be good to see and do the report again in a year's time, and to see how that number has hopefully increased also. Thank
you, and we hope to see more reports than just like the UAE, Saudi. We want to see other countries and maybe other opportunities, and I think the MENA region is huge, right? And so that would be a great segue. But I just want to take a moment to thank Leila, Roberto, and Cheryl for your involvement today. I think it's very insightful to bring our minds together around something I believe many young people are now thinking about, especially with staying at home, with how can we get more creative, and how can we actually launch a podcast. I think that Cheryl, from talking on PR strategies to Leila, understanding more around how we how storytelling and how the importance of Arab creators, I think, and from Roberto's perspective, the importance of small content. I think Neil Patel's doing an amazing job with his marketing podcast. And I think when you do daily shows, it's very, very, very hard. But if you can keep it up, it really yields very, very, very well. And you can use it as a lead magnet. You know, their newsletters. Dukan's doing an amazing show in the Middle East. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time. And please always stay connected. If anyone has any more questions, please send it to the group, and more than happy to connect offline. But on that note, I really wish everyone a great, great, great day. And thank you so much, Leila. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And thank you so much, Roberto, for joining. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.